Hey guys, so finally picking up where I left off in Hatchet. I'll be reading chapter 14, 15, and 16 today, and I'll be posting a quiz. Hopefully you've been keeping up with us. This chapter, 14, mistakes. Small mistakes could turn into disasters. Funny little mistakes could snowball, so that while you were still smiling at the humor, you could find yourself looking at death. In the city, if you made a mistake, usually there was a way to ratify it, make it all right. If he fell on his bike and sprained a leg, he could wait for it to heal. If he forgot something at the store, he could find other food in the refrigerator. Now it was different, and all so quick, also incredibly quick. If he sprained a leg here, he might starve before he could get around again. If he missed while he was hunting, or if the fish moved away, he might starve. If he got sick, really sick, so he couldn't move, he might starve. Mistakes. Early in the new time, he had learned the most important thing, the truly vital knowledge that drives all creatures in the forest. Food is all. Food was simply everything. All things in the woods, from insects to fish to bears, were always looking for food. It was the great single driving influence in nature to eat. All must eat. But the way he learned it almost killed him. His second new night, stomach full of fish, and the fire smoldering in the shelter, he had been sound asleep when something, he thought later it might be smell, had awakened him. Near the fire, completely unafraid of the smoking coals, completely unafraid of Brian, a skunk was digging where he had buried the eggs. There was some silver of the moon, and in the faint pearl light he could see the bushy tail, the white stripes down the back, and he had merely smiled. He did not know how the skunk had found the eggs. Some smell, perhaps some tiny fragment of shell, had left a smell, but it looked almost cute. Its little head down and its little tail up as it dug, kicking the sand back. But those were his eggs, not the skunk's. And the half smile had been quickly replaced with fear that he would lose his food. And he had grabbed a handful of sand and thrown it at the skunk. Get out of here! He was going to say more, some silly human words, but in less than half a second, the skunk had snapped its rear end up, curved its tail over, and sprayed Brian with a direct shot aimed at his head from less than 4 feet away. In the tiny confines of the shelter, the effect was devastating. The thick, sulphurous, rotten odor filled the small room, heavy, ugly, and stinking. The corrosive spray that hit his face smeared into his lungs and his eyes, blinding him. So Brian just got like sprayed, a sniper bullet shot right to the face by the skunk, and it went into his eyes and his mouth. So if you've never smelled a skunk like driving down the road, I mean, it is rough. It smells really bad. They've been kind of like cartoonized, like they're in cartoons. They always make them look like it's just smelly whatever. But skunks really stink, and the worst part about it is that it's hard to get off. Like once it's on you, it's on you. Like tomato sauce, and I've heard other. Um, I've heard some other. Sorry, I'm getting. Okay. Anyways, in the tiny confine, I already read that. 100 funny cartoons. I just said that. Honey, funny cartoons had had seen about skunks. Cute cartoons about the smell of skunks, cartoons to laugh and joke about. But when the spray hit, there was nothing funny about it. He was completely blind for almost 2 hours, a lifetime. So he's blind for 2 hours, just sitting there like, ugh, that's bad, or at least impaired. And that would have been the end. As it was, the pain in his eyes lasted for days, bothering him after that for 2 weeks. The smell and the shelter in his clothes, in his hair, was still there now, almost a month and a half later, and he was nearly and he had nearly smiled. Mistakes. Food was to be protected. While he was in the lake trying to clear his eyes, the skunk went ahead and dug up the rest of the turtle eggs and ate every one, licked all the shells clean, and couldn't have cared less that Brian was thrashing around in the water like a dying carp. The skunk had found food and was taking it, and Brian was paying for a lesson. Protect food and have a good shelter. Not just a shelter to keep the wind and rain, but a shelter to protect, a shelter to make him safe. The day after the skunk, he set about making a good place to live. The basic idea had been good. The place for the shelter was right, but he just hadn't gone far enough. He'd been lazy, but now he knew the second most important thing about nature, what drives nature. Food first, but the work for food went on and on. Nothing in nature was lazy. He had tried to take shortcuts, and he paid for it with his turtle eggs, which he had come to like more than chicken eggs from the store. They had been fuller somehow, had more depth to them. He set about improving his shelter by tearing it down. From dead pines up to the hill, he brought back heavier logs, fastened several of them across the opening, wedging them to the top and burying the bottoms in the sand. Then he wove long branches in through them to make a truly tight wall. And still not satisfied, he took even thinner branches and wove those into the first weave. When he was at last finished, he could not find a place to put his fist through. It had all come together like a very stiff woven blanket. So he rebuilds his shelter from the ground up, and he digs holes and he puts he basically puts up walls, and it's fully protected. He said he couldn't get a fist through. So if you can't get a fist through, you got to think animals can't get through either. He judged the door opening to be the weakest spot, and here he took special time to weave a door of willows in so tight a mesh that no matter how a skunk tried, or a porcupine, he thought, looking at the marks on his leg, it could not possibly get through. He had no hinges, but by arranging some cut off limbs at the top in the right way, he had a method to hook the door in place. And when he was in and the door was hung, he felt relatively safe. A bear, something big, could still get in by tearing at it, but nothing small could bother him, and the weave of the structure still allowed the smoke to filter up through the top and out. All, all in all, it took him 3 days to make the shelter, stopping to shoot fish and eat as he went, bathing 4 times a day to try and get the smell from the skunk to leave. When his house was finally done right, he turned to the constant problem, food. It was all right to hunt and eat, or fish and eat. But what happened if he had to go a long time without food? What happened when the berries were all gone and he got sick or hunt or thinking of the skunk, laid up temporarily? He needed a way to store food, a place to store it, and he needed food to store. Mistakes. He tried to learn from his mistakes. So Brian's planning ahead. He's realizing that he might be there for a very long time, And if he doesn't have food for when he gets sick, or if something happens to him, if he gets hurt, for basically like a reserve, like we have a refrigerator or a pantry, he might not make it. He couldn't bury food again, couldn't leave it in the shelter, because something like a bear could get at it right away. It had to be high, somehow high and safe. Above the door to the shelter, up the rock face, about 10 feet, was a small ledge that he could make a natural storage place, unreachable to animals, except that it was unreachable to him as well. Ladder, of course. He needed a ladder, but he had no way to fashion one, nothing to hold the steps on, and that stopped him until he found a dead pine with many small branches still sticking out. Using his hatchet, he chopped the branches off. They stuck out 4 to 5 inches all up along the log. Then he cut the log off about 10 feet long and dragged it down to his shelter. It was a little heavy, but dry, and he could manage it. And when he propped it up, he found he could climb to the ledge with ease, though the tree did not roll from side to side a bit as he climbed. His food shelf, as he had thought of it, had been covered with bird manure. Ew. It's not too sanitary to have bird manure where your food's going to be. So he carefully scraped it and cleaned it with sticks. He had never seen birds there, but that was probably because the smoke from the fire went up right across the opening, and they didn't like smoke. Still, he had learned, and he took time to weave a snug door for the small opening with green willows, cutting it so it jammed in tightly, and when he finished, he stood back and looked at the rock face. His shelter below, his food shelf above, and allowed a small bit of pride to come. So Brian creates the shelf. I'm going to have to get rid of this background because it's like totally like making my face disappear. Okay, I guess that's good. So Brian creates the shelf, and he learns from his mistakes. Instead of just leaving it as it is, when he sees the bird manure, he says, okay, birds could get up here, even though I've never seen them. So I need to make a door to keep my food inside. So that's what he means when he's saying he's learning from his mistakes. Not bad, he had thought. Not bad for somebody who used to have trouble greasing the bearings of his bicycle. Not bad at all. Mistakes. He had made a good shelter and food shelf, but he had no food except for fish and the last of his berries. And the fish, as good as they still tasted to him. All right, gotta turn this off. There we go. Hey. Oh, there's still background, but whatever. Tasted then were not something he could store. His mother had left some salmon out by mistake one time when they went out on an overnight trip to Cape Hester to visit relatives, and when they got back, the smell filled the whole house. There was no way to store fish. Well, there is, but you need salt and you need to dry it in the sun, which he doesn't have salt. So at least he thought, no way to store dead fish. But as he looked at the weave of the structure, a thought came to him, and he moved down to the water. He had been putting the waste from the fish back into the water, and the food had attracted hundreds of new ones. I wonder, they seemed to come easily to the food, at least the small ones. He had no trouble now shooting them, and had even speared one with the old fish spear now that he knew to aim low. He could dangle something in his fingers, and they came right up to it. It might be possible, he thought, might just be possible to trap them, make some kind of pond. To his right, at the base of the rock bluff, there were piles of smaller rocks that had fallen from the main chunk, splinters and hunks from double fist size, to some as large as his head. He spent an afternoon carrying the rocks to the beach and making what amounted to a large pen for holding live fish. Two rock arms that stuck out 15 feet into the lake and curved together at the end. Where the arms came together, he left an opening about 2 feet across, and they sat on the shore and waited. When he had first started dropping the rocks, all the fish had darted away, but his fish trash pile of bones and skins and guts was in the pond area, and the prospect of food brought them back. Soon, under an hour, there were 30 or 40 fish in the enclosure, and Brian made a gate by weaving small willows together into a fine mesh and closed them. "Fresh fish," he yelled. "I have fresh fish for sale." Storing live fish to eat later had been a major breakthrough, he thought. It wasn't just keeping from starving, it was trying to save ahead, think ahead. Of course, he didn't know then how sick he would get on fish. So he creates like this little rock enclosure, and you've got to visualize it. There are some people that have fished this way. If you don't have fishing tackle and you're in a survival situation, you can create like a little, almost like a little dam to trap fish in there. You put a little bait in it and they'll swim in there, and then you can, if you make the opening to where it like sticks or whatever, they can swim in but they can't swim out. They get trapped in there, and then it's a lot easier to catch them. Chapter 15. The days had folded one into another and mixed so that after 2 or 3 weeks, he only knew time had passed in days because he made a mark for each day in a stone near the door of his shelter. Real time he measured in events. A day was not a thing to remember. It was just sun coming up and going down, some light in the middle. But events were buried into his memory, and so he used them to remember time, to know and to remember what had happened, to keep a mental journal. There had been the day of the first meet. That had been a day that had started like the rest. Up after the sun, clean up camp, make sure there is good wood for another night. But it was a long time of eating fish and looking for berries, and he craved more food, heavier food, deeper food. He craved meat. I need meat. He thought in the night now of meat, thought of his mother's cooking a roast, or dreamed of turkey. And one night he awakened before he had to put wood on the fire, with his mouth making saliva. He's drooling. Hey, of the taste of pork chops in his mouth. So real, and all a dream. But it left him intent on getting meat. He had been working further and further out for wood, sometimes now going nearly a quarter of a mile away from the camp for wood, and he saw many small animals. He saw squirrels. They were everywhere. Some red ones that chattered at him and seemed to swear and jump from limb to limb. There were also rabbits, large gray ones with a mix of reddish fur. Smaller, fast gray ones that he saw only at dawn. The larger ones sometimes sat until he was quite close, then bounded and jerked 2 or 3 steps before freezing again. He thought if he worked and practiced, he might hit one of them, the larger rabbits, with an arrow or a spear. Never the small ones or the squirrels. They were too small and fast. Then there were the fool birds. They exasperated him to the point where they were close to driving him insane. The birds were everywhere, 5 and 6 in a flock, and their camouflage was so perfect that it was possible for Brian to sit and rest, leaning against a tree, with one of them standing right in front of him in a willow clump, 2 feet away, hidden only to explode into def- deafening flight just when Brian least expected it. Tongue-tied, least expected it. He just couldn't see them, couldn't figure out how to locate them before they flew, because they stood so perfectly still and blended in so perfectly well. And what made it worse was that they were so dumb, or seemed to be dumb, that they almost insulting the way they kept hiding from him. Nor could he get used to the way they exploded up when they flew. It seemed like every time he went for food, which was every morning, he spent the whole time jumping and jerking in fright as he walked. On one memorable morning, he had actually reached for a piece of wood, what he thought to be a pitchy stump, at the base of a dead birch, his 2 fingers close to touching it, only to have it blow up in his face. But on the day of the first meet, he decided the best thing to try for would be a full bird. And that morning, he had set out with his bow and spear to get one, to stay with it until he got one and ate some meat. Not to get wood, not to find berries, but to get a bird and eat some meat. At first, the hunt had not gone well. He saw plenty of birds working up along the shore of the lake to the end, then down the other side, but he only saw them after they flew. He had to find a way to see them first. See them and get close enough to either shoot them with his bow or use a spear. And he could not find a way to see them. When he had gone halfway around the lake and had jumped up 20 or so birds, he finally gave up and sat at the base of the tree. He had to work this out, see what he was doing wrong. There were birds there. He had eyes. He just had to bring the two things together. Looking wrong, he thought. I'm looking wrong. More and more than I am being wrong somehow. I am doing it wrong. I'm doing it the wrong way. Fine. Sarcasm came to his thoughts. I know that. Thank you. I know I'm doing it wrong, but what is right? The morning sun had cooked him until it seemed his brain was frying, sitting there by the tree, but nothing came until he got up and started to walk again, and hadn't gone 2 steps when a bird got up. It had been there all the time while he was thinking about how to see them, right next to him, right there. He almost screamed. But this time, when the bird flew, something caught his eye, and it was the secret key. The bird cut down towards the lake, seeing it couldn't land in the water, turned and flew back up the hill into the trees. When it turned, curving through the trees, the sun had caught it, and Brian, for instance, saw it as a shape, sharp pointed in front, back from the head, in a streamlined bullet shape to its fat body, kind of like a spear, he had thought, with a point on one end. Man, I'm very popular right now. And a fat little body, a flying pair. And that had been the secret. He had been looking for feathers, for the color of the bird, for the bird sitting there. He had to look for the outline instead, had to see the shape instead of the feathers or a color, had to train his eyes to see shape. It was like a turning point, turning on the television. Suddenly, he could see things he never saw before. In just moments, it seemed he saw 3 birds before they flew, saw them sitting, got close to one of them, moving slowly, got close enough to try a shot with his bow. He had missed that time. and he had missed many more, but he saw them. He saw the little fat shapes that were pointed, the little pointed heads sitting in the bush all over the place. Time and time again he drew, held and let the arrows fly, but he still had no feathers on the arrows, and they were little more than sticks that flopped down of his bows, sometimes going sideways. Even the birds was 7 or 8 feet away. The arrows would turn without feathers to stabilize it and hit a brush or a twig. After a time, he gave up with the bow. I had worked all right. It had worked all right for the fish when it came right to the end of the arrow, but it wasn't good for any kind of distance, at least not the way it was now. But he had carried his spear, the original one, with the 2 prongs, and he had moved the bow to his left hand and carried the spear in his right. He tried throwing the spear, but he was not good enough and fast enough. The birds could fly amazingly fast, get up fast. But in the end, he found that if he saw the bird sitting and moved sideways towards it, not directly towards it, but at an angle, back and forth, he could get close enough to put the spear point out ahead, almost to the bird, and thrust and lunge with it. He came close twice, and then down along the lake, not far from the beaver house, he got his first meat. The bird had sat, and he had lunged, and the 2 points took the bird back down into the ground, and he killed it almost instantly. It had flattened a bit, and Brian had grabbed it and held it in both hands until he was sure it was dead. Then he picked up the spear and the bow and trotted back around the lake to his shelter, where the fire had burned down to glowing coals. He sat looking at the bird, wondering what to do. With the fish, he had just cooked them whole, left everything, and picked the meat off. This was different. He would have to clean it. It had always been so simple at home. He would go to the store and get a chicken, and it was all clean and neat, no feathers or insides, and his mother would bake it in the oven, and he would eat it. His mother, Rex decided he's going to play with the story. His mother from the time before, would bake it. Now he had the bird, but he had never cleaned one, never taken the insides out or gotten rid of the feathers, and he didn't know where to start. But he wanted the meat, had to have the meat, and that drove him. In the end, the feathers came off easily. He tried to pluck them out, but the skin was so fragile that it pulled off as well. So he just pulled the skin off the bird, like peeling an orange, he thought of, except that when the skin was gone, the insides fell out, the back end. He was immediately caught in a cloud of raw odor, kind of steamy dung odor that came up from the greasy cool of the inside that had fell from the bird, and he nearly threw up. But there was something else, the smell as well, some kind of richness that went with his hunger, and that overcame the sick smell. So he's cleaning an animal. Mr. Metters has never hunted like a deer or anything like that, but I have seen someone clean a deer. So like animals have insides like we do, and you have to clean all that stuff out before you start cooking the meat. You can't just like cook the whole thing. You have to take out the insides, the intestines, because that stuff can make you sick. So he quickly cut off the neck with the hatchet, cut the feet off the same way, and in his hands he held something like a small chicken with a dark, fat, thick chest and small legs. He set it upon some sticks of the shelter wall and took the feathers and the insides down to the water, to his fish pond. The fish would eat them, or eat what they could, and the feeding action would bring more fish. On second thought, he cooked out the wing and tail feathers. He took out the wing and tail feathers, which were stiff and long and pretty, banded and speckled, and brown grays and red and light reds. There might be some use for them, he thought. Maybe they would work on the arrows somehow. The rest he threw in the water. Saw the small round fish begin tearing at it, and washed his hands. Back at the shelter, the flies were on the meat, and he brushed them off. It was amazing how fast they came. But when he built up the fire and the smoke increased, the flies almost magically disappeared. He pushed a pointed stick through the bird, and he held it on the fire. The fire was too hot. The flames hit the fat, and the bird almost ignited. It's like he held it higher, but the heat was worse. And finally, he moved it to the side a bit, and there it seemed to cook properly, except that it only cooked on one side, and all the juice dripped off. He had to rotate it slowly, and that was hard to do with his hands. So he found a fork and a stick, and he stuck it in the sand, and he put his cooking stick in it. He turned, and in this way he found a proper method to cook the bird. So he's made like a rotisserie. He's got to turn the bird to make sure it's getting cooked all the way through. Found a way to proper method to cook the bird. In minutes, the outside was cooked, and the odor that came up was almost the same as the odor when his mother baked chickens in the oven. And he didn't think he could stand it, but when he tried to pull a piece of the breast meat off, the meat was still raw inside. Ooh, do not want to eat raw chicken or raw bird. It can make you very sick. Patience, he thought. So much of this was patience. He waiting and thinking and doing things right. So much of all this, so much of all living was patience and thinking. He settled back, turning the bird slowly, letting the juices go back into the meat, letting it cook and smell and cook. And there came a time when it didn't matter if the meat was done or not. It was black on the outside and hard and hot, and he would eat it. He tore a piece from the breast and a sliver of meat, and he put it in his mouth and chewed slowly and carefully, as he could get all the taste. And he thought, Gideon, stop. Never in all the food, all the hamburgers and the malts, all the fries or the meals at home, never in all the candy or pies, cakes, never in all the roast or steaks or pizzas, never in all the submarine sandwiches, never had he tasted anything as fine as his first bite, his first meat. So he makes like a rotisserie chicken, and it's the best thing he's ever ate. So let me see how long chapter 16 is. All right, chapter 16 is pretty long. I'm gonna stop there. So we're just gonna read 2 for today. Hope you enjoyed. I'll have a quiz for you. Make sure you take the quiz so you can get some credit. Thanks for listening and checking out this video. All right, see you later, guys.